Welcome back to the Foxhole. I'm your host, James Rosen, coming to you from the Washington Bureau of Fox News. You can follow me on Twitter at JamesRosenFNC. In my college career at the Johns Hopkins University, macro and microeconomics stood astride all other subjects, with D's and D minuses being racked up, the twin towers of ignominy, in an otherwise creditable, if not world-beating transcript of courses and grades. To me, all of those charts and curves, sliding scales and percentages, statistical anomalies and capital adequacy ratios represented a mystifying veil of high-concept mumbo-jumbo that I, with my enduring infelicity with numbers, a problem since childhood, found utterly impenetrable. Our visitor to the Foxhole today is here with good news. A, that I'm not alone. B, that if you feel as I do about economics, that it absolutely warrants its label of the dismal science, you're not alone. And C, that understanding this feature so central to a capitalist society is not anywhere near as hard as your teachers and professors made out. John Tamny is the editor of RealClearMarkets.com, political economy editor at Forbes magazine, and the author of Popular Economics, What the Rolling Stones, Downton Abbey, and LeBron James Can Teach You About Economics, published in April by Regnery Publishing. John Tamny, welcome to the Foxhole.
Thank you.
So what are we all missing when we all believe that economics is so difficult to understand? How has this great lie been perpetrated upon us?
Well, I think it's been perpetrated by economists who quite simply don't understand what they teach. Walter Williams once told me that his professor at UCLA told him, if you can't explain economic principles to the average person, you don't understand it. And so that's what my book is about. Nothing could be simpler than economics, and we're missing out on enormous prosperity because people don't understand how easy it would be to achieve much greater economic growth. And so the way I do it is simplify it. You want to understand taxes, why they can be corrosive to growth? Let's look at the Rolling Stones and their migrations. You want to understand why regulation cannot work? Let's look at University of Michigan football's loss to Appalachian State. You want to understand why free trade drives so much prosperity? Let's look at LeBron James. You want to understand monetary policy intimately? Let's look at something as prosaic as the buffalo chicken wing.
All right, let's look at the buffalo chicken wing. Tell me what I'm not seeing when I gaze upon a buffalo chicken wing.
Well, what you're not seeing is all the exactitude that goes into making what is so simple. There's a certain amount, a tablespoon of Tabasco sauce. There's a cup of flour. There's all sorts that goes into specifics that go into making the sauce and bathing basically the chicken wing so that you can put it in the fryer. And then you have to have a specific time in the fryer to come out with something that's very edible. Now imagine what would happen if suddenly the tablespoon and teaspoon were moving around in size, and that the cup was moving around in size, and that the minute didn't have a definition of 60 seconds. There would be a lot of inedible buffalo chicken wings. Well, that's the way we should think about money. Money's not wealth. You can't take it to a desert island and get anything for it. You can't eat it. Money is how we measure the real wealth we create in society. I've got wine. I want your bread. Money is how I measure the value of my wine so that I can get your bread because maybe you want to get something from the butcher. Money is how we translate true wealth values. And so when it floats around in value, it's robbed of its singular purpose, which is a medium of exchange. And when we lose that, we're not trading, which is the purpose of our work. We're also not investing as much in the ideas of the future because we don't know what we're going to get back.
You are not a trained economist.
No, I'm not.
You studied political science. And what did you do after you graduated from school with a political science degree?
I worked, oddly enough, for an environmental firm that helped oil companies deal with all sorts of compliance issues. And then I went to Vanderbilt Business School, and then I worked for Goldman Sachs and First Boston out of business school in New York. And sitting there at work every day, I loved the job, but I looked around me and I thought, these people love it a lot more than I do. And so I knew right then that I had to get into something that I enjoyed, and economics has always fascinated me. And I watched what they were saying on CNBC, and I thought, this is not fair what they're teaching people. They're teaching people economic falsehoods, and they're also making what's basic very complicated.
What do you regard as, say, the most prevalent economic falsehood under which most Americans this very moment are laboring?
I think probably the biggest one is the idea that government's got to stimulate demand, and so the government must spend with abandon in order to get the economy moving. Let's face it, we are wired to demand things. That's why we get up in the morning. We go to work, we go to school before we get jobs, because we want to exchange the fruits of our labor for all the things that we don't have. Governments never need to stimulate demand. What can they do? The only thing they can do to help an economy grow is stimulate the supply side of the economy, remove the government barriers to our need to produce. And so taxes are a barrier. They're a price placed on work. Regulations restrict our ability to pursue profits. Trade is the reason we work, and then money is how we exchange our work for all the things that we don't have. There's this belief that government needs to stimulate this. Oh gosh, no, all we do is demand. We need to produce first.
I do know some people who consider themselves, roughly speaking, conservatives on the matter of taxing and spending, and who generally favor a leaner federal government, but who nonetheless subscribe to the idea that when the American economy reaches a period of extremis, then it really is imperative that the federal government spend money. So are there certain times when government spending is a better idea than other times?
Never, because it's got to be remembered, governments have no resources. That's not some libertarian slogan, that's just fact. They can only spend what they've taxed or borrowed from us first. And so when you consider government spending during times of hardship, basically what you're doing is moving capital allocation duties to John Boehner and Nancy Pelosi and taking them away from Warren Buffett, Paul Tudor Jones, Jeff Bezos of Amazon, Fred Smith of FedEx. You're basically removing capital allocation from the experts and handing it to politicians who are not experts at capital allocation. And so by definition, the last time you want governments to spend with abandon is during times of major hardship, because you want to leave those resources in the private sector where they can do the most good. We've got lots of examples of this, but most famously in 1920 and 21, the U.S. economy contracted, and it did so substantially, far more than 29 and 30. The big difference, the reason we don't hear about that recession is because it's so short. Why? Government spending was slashed from $6.4 billion in 1920 to $3.3 billion in 1923. All those resources were left in the private sector, and a major boom took place.
Our visitor to the Foxhole today is John Tamny, editor of RealClearMarkets.com, political economy editor at Forbes magazine, and author of Popular Economics, What the Rolling Stones, Downton Abbey, and LeBron James Can Teach You About Economics, published in April by Regnery Publishing. When did it dawn on you, across the course of your career, that economics was so poorly taught and widely misunderstood?
I was sitting on the floor, on the trading floor at Goldman Sachs, and they're talking on CNBC about how if the economy keeps growing, remember this is the late 90s, it's going to cause inflation. I said, wait a second, I grew up in the 1970s. I know what inflation is. It's not the result of too much economic growth, it's the result of devaluation of the currency, which usually leads to slower economic growth because it reduces investment in real economic ideas. And I thought, if this is what economists believe, I'm going to make it my life's work to disprove this idea that somehow prosperity is bad. And so that's how I began in the economic space. I started writing surreptitiously for clients at Goldman about the truth on inflation. And I got so excited about it, I thought, they've got this so wrong, the economics profession. And Ben Bernanke pursued this false argument that growth is inflationary. I am going to prove, and I talk about it in the book, why in fact inflation is the exact opposite of what economists believe.
Is there, in your lifetime as an adult, a Democratic politician or office holder whom you would identify as pro-growth?
Yeah, there are a lot of them back in the 1970s and early 80s. What people forget, and Robert Novak actually pointed it out well in his autobiography toward the end of his career, is that the Democrats used to be the slow growth party, but in the early 80s, remember, Phil Gramm was a Democratic congressman who made the Reagan tax cuts possible. Remember, Lloyd Benson was one of the big drivers of the Reagan tax cuts, getting them passed. Wilbur Mills, the House Ways and Means chairman from Arkansas, was a big proponent of tax cuts. Oddly, it was the Republicans who were against them. Ronald Reagan was ridiculed in his own party, not just by George H.W. Bush. Alan Greenspan said that he had major problems with the Laffer-Reagan view of taxes. James Baker, the Treasury Secretary, was very much against the Reagan tax cuts, leaking against them from the Reagan White House, but from the Treasury. Paul Volcker, the Fed chairman, was actively leaking against the Reagan tax cuts. Now, he was a Democrat. The Democrats used to be the pro-growth party as recently, realistically, as the early 80s.
And what about Bill Clinton? Would you say that he was a pro-growth Democrat?
I think in many ways it was forced upon him, and I think he deserves credit for basically sensing the political winds and moving with them. Clinton admitted in 1996, when he ran for his second term, that he got those tax increases wrong in 1993. He said he wished he hadn't done them. We can point out that he signed welfare reform, very much pushed by Republicans, but that's good. He also signed a cut in the capital gains rate. There are no companies and no jobs without investment first. He signed it in 1997. And then I think the biggest thing he did, and I talk about it a lot in my book, is that he brought on Robert Rubin as Treasury Secretary. Presidents get the dollar they want. You need a strong dollar to attract the investment that leads to the company creation. President Clinton his administration was very much in favor of a strong dollar. It was not bashing the Japanese, it was for a strong, stable dollar. And it's no mistake that we had booming economic times under Clinton, but also under Ronald Reagan. They both understood the importance of the dollar.
And where the incumbent is concerned, what view do you take of Barack Obama as the steward of the American economy?
What a tragedy. He could have been easily the most popular president in modern times if he had gotten into office and simply done nothing. He's been criticized for playing too much golf. If he had reached office and said, you know what, I am unequal to the problems in the economy that I've inherited, I'm going to sit back and do nothing, the economy would have taken off. Instead, what did he do? He imposed with Congress a $780 billion stimulus plan that took nearly $1 trillion out of the private sector of the economy. He then tried to, in his somewhat succeeding in a failed way at imposing a major health care plan on the economy. He's tried to re-regulate finance, energy, you name it. If he had sat back and done nothing, he'd be overseeing a boom right now, and there's a reason for that. Recessions, despite what economists tell us, are in fact beautiful. They're just a signal that the individuals who comprise an economy are fixing themselves, that they're ridding themselves of all the bad habits they got into when times were better. And it's what companies are doing too, also in a recession. They are cleansing themselves of all the mistakes. And that's why when recessions are left alone, when government sits back and does nothing, the result is always a major economic boom, because the recession is the sign of an economy fixing itself, cleansing itself. If Obama had done nothing, he'd be a very successful president today. Instead, he tried to medicate the economy in the way that FDR did. And the result is that he's overseen a largely slow growth era during his time in office. And it's all because he tried to fix what government is unable to fix.
Doesn't history, or the consensus view of history, record that Franklin Roosevelt helped the United States emerge from the Great Depression?
That's popular history, and it's wildly false. The simple truth is that the economy fell into recession in 1929. Nothing new about that. That's the general norm. Every so often, an economy starts to fix itself, basically cleanse all the excesses, all the errors taking place. In response to this, quite unlike 1920 and 21, President Hoover and then President Roosevelt, they decided to medicate what was a very healthy scenario. They increased government spending wildly. They increased the top tax rate on income from 25 all the way to 83%. This is both of them over time. Trade was made less free. Trade's the reason we work. Businesses were regulated a lot more, and then FDR devalued the dollar from 1/20th of an ounce of gold to 1/35th of an ounce of gold, which told investors, if you want to commit capital to the ideas of the future, you're taking a big risk because we will devalue any returns. The Great Depression was entirely a creation of government error. If they had sat back and done nothing, we would have had a major economic boom in the 30s. Odds are FDR is not even ever president. We probably, you could argue, we don't have World War II either.
Of course, we're plunged into the counterfactual to say that had had they done nothing, X would have transpired, is something that we can't ever truly know, of course. But wouldn't Barack Obama, in his defense, say, look, I arranged for tax cuts for middle-class families?
He could argue that, but what are you going to achieve with a tax cut for middle-class families? You're not going to get much of an economic response to that. Let's face it, there are, once again, no companies and no jobs without investment first. For an entrepreneur to animate his idea, he must attract capital. Where does that exist? Sorry, it resides with the rich. I'm not a rich person, but they've got all the money. And so if you want to get a boom from a tax cut, the best way to do it is to reduce the burdens on those with the most wealth, because they can put the most of it to work in the Googles and Intels and Microsofts of the future.
To what do you attribute the resistance to that idea, and where do you locate it most acutely?
I locate it among Republicans and Democrats, and I think what it is neither party understands economic growth. In the Republicans' case, they don't believe their message that they make so strongly about limited government. What is so bad? How have we been harmed by Jeff Bezos making it possible for us to order the world's plenty all with a mouse? Why are we worse off because Steve Jobs made it possible to have phones in our pockets with amazing computer power on which we can watch TV and send emails? Are we worse off because Michael Dell took a computer that in the 1960s cost $1.5 million and that now costs a few $100s? No, would we be better off if they'd been layabouts? Why can't we elevate success in this country and say, let's stop penalizing it? We want 10 of Michael Dell. We want 10 of Jeff Bezos. And the only way to get there is through constant investment in new ideas.
How can you be sure you won't wind up with 10 Enrons as opposed to 10 Apples?
Let's hope we have a few Enrons. Capitalism and achievement is all about failure. Silicon Valley is not the richest area of the United States, if not the world, because all of its businesses succeed. It's the richest precisely because the vast majority of its startups fail. And through failure, you get perfection. You learn what not to do in the future. You learn with each failure. That's the process of information. Think back to Detroit. Detroit is a wasteland today. 100 years ago, Detroit was Silicon Valley. And guess what? 2,000 car companies sprouted up in that area. 99% of them failed. Did this make Detroit an economic wasteland or a disaster? No, it made it wildly prosperous. It's through the leap, the constant search for new ideas, the experimentation, Thomas Edison, Steve Jobs, these people taking risks on new ideas all the time. That's how you get economic growth, and you need some Enrons so that you can get the Microsofts and GEs and Apples.
One of the great villains in your book is the regulator, right? Whom you depict as someone who is utterly incapable of practicing that which they presume to regulate, and therefore has no business regulating these shackled giants. One wonders if you would envision, ideally, from where you sit, a society or an economy that is utterly free of regulation altogether. And if so, isn't the standard response to that, well, look at the child labor laws. No one would want an 8-year-old working in a sweatshop situation. That is a regulation, obviously a necessity. Or no, from where you sit?
I'd rather live without regulations. Let's face it, people are going to work out of necessity, but where are the societies where they're least likely to work when they're children? In the most economically advanced. And regulations hold back economic advancement. Let's face it, thanks to our economy being largely free of government meddling over time, children don't need to think about working when they're growing up. What they get to think about is fun and going to school, and they get to think about what they will do when they grow up. We forget what an amazing thing that is. In most parts of the world, it is about survival. In the United States, we get to think about the future. And so when you think about regulation, what an utter waste. Let's talk about 2008. The banking sector was easily the most regulated in the U.S. economy, yet those charged with overseeing the banks not only didn't have a clue about the problems within them, they were actively encouraging and rewarding banks for making the errors they did. And the reason for this is obvious. If you're a regulator, almost by definition, you're the person who could not get a job in the industry you're regulating. Let's face it.
It's like Woody Allen's famous maxim that those who can't do teach, and those who can't teach teach Jim.
Absolutely, it's true.
Maybe you can add him to the next edition.
Well, you know, I should have been there. The Wolf of Wall Street wasn't a great movie. One of the things they got right about it was that the regulator in the movie going after Leonardo DiCaprio's character tried to get into the business. And the reason he was not in the business is he did not pass the Series 7, which is an exam you take to be in the brokerage business. I've taken that. That is a driver's test. You've got to try really hard not to pass this exam. And so you're asking those who are not terribly talented to oversee the brightest financial minds on earth.
I mean, couldn't the same be said of the athletic coach who, you know, we're asking to oversee the LeBron James? Even LeBron James needs a coach, right?
Yeah, no, it's a very good point, but we're asking two different things. We're asking, in this case, the coach to devise strategy and teach people how to do things. What does regulation presume? It is about looking into the future and seeing what the markets aren't seeing to avoid the calamity that's coming. Well, if you can see into the future like that, you are worth billions. And let's face it, who found out the problems in the banking sector? It wasn't regulators, it was hedge funds. It was hedge fund managers like John Paulson who thought, this doesn't look right. I am going to raise a fund that is going to bet against the direction of mortgages, and he's worth $15 to $20 billion today. Free markets discovered the problems in industry, not regulators.
Our visitor to the Foxhole today is John Tamny, editor of RealClearMarkets.com, political economy editor at Forbes magazine, and author of Popular Economics, What the Rolling Stones, Downton Abbey, and LeBron James Can Teach You About Economics, published in April by Regnery Publishing. You write in Popular Economics, and I quote, "And that's the point about government spending, as in why we must focus on it over deficits. Economic growth is once again about the leap. It's about experimentation, about taking risks on new ideas. When government is a size consumer of capital, what's left must be rationed more carefully to the sure things that will pay a return over the riskier ideas that may go belly up. The problem is that it's hard to achieve the big economic leaps if capital is scarce. If it is, we've got to be conservative simply because we have less to work with thanks to a reduced margin for error. But if we're conservative, that script for the French Connection may lie dormant forever. On the other hand, if government is conservative when it comes to spending, there's more capital available. And with the pool increased, we can cut a small slice of a much bigger capital pie and commit it to the risk takers." Some will say that this is just an apologia for the rich.
No, it's the exact opposite. It's the way of getting capital that would otherwise be consumed by John Boehner and Nancy Pelosi and getting it to those who might be rich if they can have their dreams funded. Let's face it, French Connection is mentioned there. It took years to get it made. They went around from studio to studio and could not find funding for it. Finally, 20th Century Fox said, we like the idea of the script. Here's $1.5 million, go make it. Thank goodness it transformed movie making. Let's look at ESPN. ESPN was a total joke in the late 70s. It nearly went under, but for a $10 million investment by the Getty Oil Trust. And thanks to that investment, ESPN was able to evolve in what it is today. You look at in sports, Russell Maryland is now in the College Football Hall of Fame. Back when he was in high school, he was the last scholarship given out by Jimmy Johnson for the University of Miami Hurricanes.
Isn't it true that that 75%, the lion's share of new jobs in this country are created not by those who are wealthy, as you have made the case here so far, but by small business owners who are not by definition wealthy?
Not by definition wealthy, but who have a dream. But the only way you can turn what is an idea into reality is you must attract capital. And in most instances, what we're describing with ESPN, with the French Connection, with a company like Apple, you are describing big risk because most often these ideas fail. Apple was started in a garage, and neither Republican nor Democrat is going to fund that with government money. It's too out there. And so you want to leave as much capital in the private sector possible just so people will take risks, because a lot of those small businesses that start in a garage, as Apple did, will eventually be big. We've got to fund those leaps to move ahead economy-wise, and when government is consuming capital, it's robbing us of that risk capital that's going to fund the future.
Is there someone in 2016 you like?
Oh, in a perfect world, I guess I'm sort of intrigued by Rand Paul because he is the least interested in expanding the size of government, but you know, it remains to be seen. Most politicians aren't making this argument right now. More and more you hear them say, well, if we cut government spending too much, there's going to be a recession. If we reduce the burden, they're afraid to reduce government's role in a lot of areas. The size of government today, now let's face it, it has certain functions. We need to provide for a common defense. There are things the federal government must do. But imagine what we're missing out on. We have to consider the unseen, the cancer cures that were never funded, the transportation advances that would make the private jet of today seem minor by comparison, the communication advances that would make the internet seem very dated. That's what's not taking place because of this burden that is government that we are funding with our dollars. We've got to stop talking about the sacrifices of reducing the size of government and instead talk about how much better all of our lives will be if government is spending less of the wealth that we've by definition created.
And if tomorrow the government were hacked down to the size you think appropriate for an economy like ours, what would become of all the recipients of Social Security spending and the other recipients of the other people who depend on what's called the safety net? What would be the human cost?
Well, we've made promises to them, and there's nothing in my model that says we should not fulfill those promises. What I would say about Social Security is for people who are younger, why not? Why not enjoy having your own retirement? Why not give people at least the option to say, I want out of this deal with the government. I am going to take my retirement with me. Those who want to stay within it, I have no problem with it. It's a promise we made. But let's give people the option to live with less government.
What is your favorite Rolling Stones song?
Oh, it's easily, Gimme Shelter, without question.
Our visitor to the Foxhole today has been John Tamny, editor of RealClearMarkets.com, political economy editor at Forbes magazine, and author of Popular Economics: What the Rolling Stones, Downton Abbey, and LeBron James Can Teach You About Economics, published in April by Regnery Publishing and now in its second printing. John, thanks for visiting us.
Thank you very much.
That'll do it for this episode of the Foxhole. I'm your host, James Rosen, signing off from the Washington Bureau of Fox News. You can follow me on Twitter at James Rosen FNC, and we will FNC you next time.